My brother stole my business plan worth $5 million while I was in the hospital, until the investors called me. People think betrayal comes with sirens and explosions. That it announces itself with dramatic confrontations and slammed doors. But they're wrong. Real betrayal? It's surgical. Methodical. 1,000 tiny cuts delivered by the hands you trust most, until you're bleeding out and wondering how you never saw it coming. My name is Ellie McAllister, and I learned this lesson the hardest way possible, when my own brother carved out my heart and served it to me on a silver platter. They say blood is thicker than water, but nobody tells you what happens when that blood turns poisonous. When the person who shared your childhood, your dreams, your parents' grave, decides that everything you've built should belong to them instead. I'm getting ahead of myself though. This story doesn't start with the betrayal. It starts 5 years earlier, in a cramped garage in Portland, Oregon, where I was building something that would change the world. Or so I thought. What I didn't know was that I was also building my own destruction, one trust-filled decision at a time. And the architect of that destruction was sitting right across from me at every family dinner, wearing the face I'd known since childhood. But we'll get to that. First, let me tell you about Verde Bloom, and how it became worth killing for. Verde Bloom wasn't just a business idea, it was my obsession. A self-sustaining modular farming system designed to bring fresh produce to inner cities and food deserts. While tech bros were building the next social media app, I was trying to feed people. The concept was revolutionary, stackable hydroponic units that could operate in warehouses, rooftops, even abandoned buildings. Each module could produce enough vegetables to feed 50 families year-round, using 90% less water than traditional farming and zero pesticides. I'd been perfecting the system for 5 years, mostly working alone in my garage. Coding the automated nutrient delivery systems, designing the LED growth matrices, testing every variable until my fingers bled from handling prototype wiring. My personal life was non-existent. Relationships crumbled under the weight of my 16-hour days. Friends stopped calling. But every breakthrough felt like salvation, not just for me, but for the millions of Americans living in food deserts. The first successful harvest brought tears to my eyes. Pristine lettuce, tomatoes, and herbs growing in perfect rows under soft blue light. I partnered with a local food bank to run a 6-week trial. The results were stunning, fresh produce in a neighborhood that hadn't seen quality vegetables in decades. I called my brother Garrett that night, voice shaking with excitement. I did it, I whispered into the phone. I actually did it. His voice was warm, proud. I knew you would, Ellie. You're brilliant. If I could go back to that moment, I'd hang up the phone and run. Garrett wasn't a tech guy, but he had something I lacked, the ability to make people believe. Where I stumbled through investor pitches with technical jargon and nervous energy, he walked into boardrooms like he owned them. You need me, sis, he said over coffee at our usual spot downtown. You've got the genius, but I've got the charm. We could be unstoppable. He wasn't wrong. My first attempts at raising capital had been disasters. I'd overwhelm potential investors with technical specifications while forgetting to explain why they should care. Garrett could distill my 5-year obsession into a 3-minute pitch that left executives reaching for their checkbooks. Making him COO felt natural. He handled the business side while I focused on perfecting the technology. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a partner instead of shouldering everything alone. The dynamic worked beautifully, at first. Garrett secured our initial seed funding, a modest $500,000 that allowed us to build our first commercial prototype. He negotiated supplier contracts while I refined the growing algorithms. We're the perfect team, he'd tell investors. Ellie's the brain, I'm the voice. I should have noticed how often he said "I" when describing our achievements. How he'd interrupt me during technical explanations to clarify for our audience. How his version of events slowly began erasing my contributions. A part of me bristled each time, but I told myself it didn't matter. We were building the same dream. Weren't we? But I was too grateful, too focused on the work, too blind to see what was growing in the shadows of our partnership. 2 years ago, everything I thought I knew about loss got redefined in a single phone call. Ellie? Garrett's voice was hollow, unrecognizable. There's been an accident. Mom and Dad. Black ice on I-84. The semi-truck driver walked away without a scratch while my parents died on impact. The randomness of it, the sheer cosmic cruelty, left me unable to breathe for weeks. Garrett handled the funeral arrangements while I sat catatonic in my apartment. He gave the eulogy because I couldn't string 3 words together without dissolving. He became my anchor when the world felt like it was spinning off its axis. Grief affects everyone differently. I threw myself into Verde Bloom with desperate intensity, working 20-hour days until exhaustion forced me to sleep. If I could just perfect the next module, solve the next technical challenge, maybe the pain would stop. Garrett's approach was different. He became possessive. Of memories, of family traditions, of the company. This is all we have left of them, he'd say, gesturing around our office. Dad would have wanted us to make this work. Over the next 9 months, grief blurred into routine, and Garrett became the public face of Verde Bloom while I quietly coded through my sorrow. I didn't recognize the manipulation then. How he was slowly repositioning Verde Bloom as a family legacy instead of my individual creation. How he'd invoke our parents' memory whenever I questioned his decisions. Mom always said you were too trusting, he'd tell me after particularly difficult investor meetings. Good thing you have me to protect you. The serpent in the garden, disguised as my guardian angel. The signs were there, if I'd been clear-headed enough to see them. Small things at first. Garrett would speak for me in meetings, cutting off my explanations with phrases like, "What Ellie means is." Or, "Let me clarify that for you." He'd rewrite my technical documentation to sound more investor-friendly, slowly erasing the precise language that made my innovations unique. I found internal memos he'd written referring to himself as co-founder instead of COO. When I confronted him, he laughed it off. Semantics, Ellie. Investors prefer partnership narratives over lone genius stories. It's more marketable. He started bringing his own contacts to the table. Slick MBA types who spoke in buzzwords and treated technical innovation like a checkbox to be optimized. They'd nod politely during my presentations, then huddle with Garrett afterward for strategic discussions. I wasn't invited to join. The breaking point should have been when I discovered he'd been meeting with potential investors without me. When I finally asked about it, his explanation was so reasonable, so perfectly crafted, that I felt guilty for questioning him. You hate those meetings, Ellie. I'm just shielding you from the business politics so you can focus on what you do best, he said, hand on my shoulder like I was a child. Trust me, isn't that what partners do? I wanted to believe him. Needed to believe him. That desperation to trust nearly cost me everything. It started with what felt like the worst case of food poisoning in human history. Doubled over in my apartment at 3 a.m., I initially blamed the questionable sushi from the previous night. But the pain kept escalating, spreading from my abdomen to my back, until I could barely stand. Garrett found me collapsed on my bathroom floor 12 hours later when I missed our investor meeting. His face went white when he saw me, shivering, delirious, barely conscious. Jesus, Ellie. How long have you been like this? The hospital admission blurred together. Emergency surgery for a ruptured appendix that had gone septic. The infection had spread through my bloodstream, sending my organs into crisis mode. What should have been routine surgery became a fight for my life. The doctors put me in an induced coma to give my body time to heal. 6 days of medical purgatory while machines kept me breathing and antibiotics waged war against the poison in my veins. Garrett never left the hospital. He slept in the uncomfortable chair beside my bed, holding my hand and talking to my unconscious form about Verde Bloom updates and recovery plans. The nurses all commented on what a devoted brother he was. If only they knew what he was planning. When I finally woke up, weak and disoriented, Garrett's first words were reassuring, "Everything's fine. The company's running smoothly. Just focus on getting better." I should have asked more questions. Instead, I trusted him. What I didn't know. What I couldn't know, trapped in that hospital bed, was that Garrett had already activated what he'd call his contingency plan. Within hours of my surgery, he'd called an emergency board meeting. Our small circle of investors gathered in the conference room while I fought for my life, and Garrett painted a picture of a company in crisis. "Ellie's brilliant, but this health scare has shown us how vulnerable we are," he told them, his voice heavy with manufactured concern. "What happens to Verde Bloom if she can't recover? What happens to your investments?" He had prepared slides, professional, polished presentations outlining succession plans and leadership transitions. Nothing explicit about removing me, just risk mitigation strategies and operational continuity measures. Janie Brookfield, our lead investor, raised concerns about making decisions while I was incapacitated. Garrett's response was masterful in its manipulation. "Of course we'll wait for Ellie's input on major decisions," he assured them. "But she's under heavy sedation and doctors say not to disturb her recovery. Day-to-day operations can't stop, the contracts won't wait, and neither will our competitors." He requested and received temporary operational authority, the right to make binding decisions in my absence. A reasonable precaution that became the key to my kingdom. While I lay unconscious, Garrett wasn't just keeping the lights on. He was systematically positioning himself to steal everything. And he had the perfect accomplice waiting in the wings. Andy Kowalski was 26, brilliant, and desperately insecure. Fresh out of MIT with a computer science PhD, he joined Verde Bloom 6 months earlier as our lead developer. Technically gifted but socially awkward, he worshipped the ground I walked on and hung on my every word. He was also Garrett's perfect target. While I was in my coma, Garrett began working on Andy systematically. Friendly conversations about career advancement. Casual mentions of how the tech industry rewards bold moves. Subtle suggestions that loyalty to a potentially disabled founder might limit his opportunities. "I've been thinking about your future here, Andy," Garrett said during one of their late-night, emergency, coding sessions. "You're incredibly talented, but Ellie's situation has me worried about the company's direction." Andy was receptive. He'd always felt overlooked in his previous jobs, passed over for promotions by less qualified candidates with better social skills. Garrett offered him something he'd never had before, recognition and respect. "If something happens to Ellie, this company will need strong technical leadership," Garrett continued. "Someone who understands the systems inside and out. Someone like you." The bait was irresistible. Chief Technology Officer. Equity shares. His name on patents instead of hiding in my shadow. All he had to do was help Garrett prepare for various scenarios. Andy convinced himself he was protecting the company's future. In reality, he was about to become an accessory to the theft of my life's work. The plan they hatched together was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. Creating Nova Harvest required surgical precision. Garrett and Andy couldn't simply copy Verde Bloom. That would be obvious theft. Instead, they crafted a sophisticated mirror image that maintained plausible deniability. Andy's technical skills made him invaluable. He understood my code architecture better than anyone except me, knew which innovations were truly revolutionary and which were standard engineering. Working 18-hour days while I lay unconscious, he began building what he called version 2.0. The growing algorithms were re-implemented with different variable names but identical logic. The LED lighting patterns were reorganized but functionally equivalent. The nutrient delivery systems were redesigned with new interface designs but the same underlying mechanics. Most importantly, Andy scrubbed my authorship from the code commits. Git logs that had tracked 5 years of my innovation were rewritten to show collaborative development between him and Garrett. My breakthrough moments became team discoveries. The irony was devastating. I'd only backed up locally, and my personal laptop had been left at the office during my hospitalization. Andy had access to everything, and I had no remote repositories to prove my authorship. Garrett handled the business side with equal sophistication. The Nova Harvest brand emerged as a natural evolution of our work, modern, sleek, investor-friendly. The pitch deck borrowed my language, my market research, my projections, but reframed them as Garrett's vision. They filed provisional patents under the new company name, established separate corporate entities, and began reaching out to potential investors as the next generation of urban agriculture. All while I recovered from sepsis, trusting that my brother was protecting my interests. In just 3 weeks, they built a replica of my life's work and prepared to bury the original. Garrett's genius wasn't in the theft itself, it was in the timing and presentation. Rather than hiding Nova Harvest from our existing investors, he positioned it as Verde Bloom's strategic evolution. Ellie and I have been discussing this transition for months, he told our board during a carefully orchestrated conference call. The near-death experience has given her new perspective on the company's direction. He had forged emails between us discussing rebranding opportunities and fresh approaches. I'd shared my passwords with him years ago, just in case. I never changed them. Andy had backdated code commits to suggest our collaboration on the new platform. Everything looked legitimate on paper. The investors were skeptical but intrigued. Garrett's presentation was flawless, passionate, detailed, financially sound. He answered technical questions with Andy's coaching and business questions with his natural confidence. This isn't abandoning Verde Bloom, he assured them. This is Verde Bloom growing up. Janie Brookfield was the holdout. She'd invested in me personally, not just the technology, and she sensed something wrong in Garrett's narrative. But even her concerns were expertly managed. I understand your attachment to Ellie's original vision, Garrett told her privately. But she's changed. The health scare affected her more than she'll admit. She's not the same driven founder you invested in. He painted me as damaged goods, brilliant but unreliable, innovative but no longer capable of leading. A tragic figure who needed protection from the harsh realities of business. The $5 million deal that should have been mine was restructured around Nova Harvest, with Garrett as CEO and Andy as CTO. All they needed was my signature, which they planned to obtain through one final manipulation. I was finally home from the hospital, weak but determined to get back to work. 2 weeks of recovery had left me anxious about Verde Bloom's progress, but Garrett's daily updates had been reassuring. Everything's under control, he kept saying. Just focus on healing. That Tuesday morning, I was struggling to eat breakfast when my phone buzzed with a text from Janie Brookfield. Strange new branding, Ellie. Everything okay? Nova Harvest seems like a departure. The words hit me like an electric shock. Nova Harvest? I'd never heard the name before. My hands shook as I read the message again, trying to make sense of it. I called Janie immediately, my voice still hoarse from the breathing tube. What new branding? What are you talking about? The silence on the other end stretched too long. When Janie finally spoke, her voice was careful, concerned. Ellie, didn't you approve the rebrand? Garrett said you two had decided on Nova Harvest as the new company name. He showed us the revised pitch deck yesterday. The room started spinning. Yesterday, Garrett had told me he was handling routine investor check-ins. Nothing major, just keeping them updated on your recovery. I never approved anything, I whispered. Janie's intake of breath was audible. Oh, honey. I think we need to talk. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. And for the first time since waking up, I realized my brother might not be the protector I thought he was. I couldn't confront Garrett directly, not yet. If something shady was happening, I needed evidence before he could cover his tracks. But in my weakened state, I needed help. Kira Chen had been my roommate in college and was now a successful intellectual property lawyer in Seattle. More importantly, she was the only person I trusted completely outside of my family. When I called her that afternoon, my voice was shaking. Kira, I need your help. Something's wrong with my company. She caught the next flight to Portland. Within hours, Kira had launched a full investigation into Verde Bloom's recent activities. What she discovered was worse than my darkest suspicions. Corporate filings showed Nova Harvest LLC had been registered 11 days earlier, while I was in my coma. Patent applications had been submitted under the new company name, claiming innovations I'd developed over 5 years. The filing dates were backdated to suggest development had begun months ago. "This is systematic fraud," Kira said, her lawyer's mask slipping to show pure rage. "They've stolen your intellectual property and hidden it behind corporate shell games." But the smoking gun was in the code itself. Andy had been clever about obscuring the theft, but he'd made one crucial mistake: the commenting style. Every programmer has unique habits, and my comments were distinctive, detailed explanations peppered with dry humor and obscure references. Buried deep in Nova Harvest's codebase were comments that could only have come from me. Fragments of my personality embedded in lines of code, proving beyond doubt that this was my stolen work. "We have them," Kira said grimly. But we still needed to figure out how deep the betrayal went. The evidence Kira compiled painted a picture of betrayal so comprehensive it took my breath away. This wasn't opportunistic theft, it was a carefully planned heist that had been months in the making. Garrett had been laying groundwork long before my hospitalization. Email chains showed him questioning my leadership to investors, subtle suggestions about my erratic behavior, and concerning decision-making. He'd positioned himself as the stable, reliable partner who could steer the company through my supposed instability. Andy's involvement was equally calculated. Text messages between him and Garrett revealed the full scope of their conspiracy. Andy hadn't just helped steal my code, he'd actively sabotaged my work, introducing subtle bugs into the original Verde Bloom system while ensuring Nova Harvest ran flawlessly. "They wanted you to fail," Kira said, showing me the evidence on her laptop. "If Verde Bloom crashed while Nova Harvest succeeded, it would legitimize their narrative that you'd lost your edge." The financial trail was damning. Garrett had already secured preliminary agreements with 3 major investors for Nova Harvest, totaling $5 million in funding. The contracts were structured to cut me out entirely. I wasn't even listed as a consultant or advisor. But the most devastating discovery was personal. Garrett had recorded our conversations during my recovery, using my confused, medication-influenced responses to create evidence that I'd approved the transition to Nova Harvest. He'd weaponized my trust, my illness, and my love for him to steal everything I'd built. The brother I'd grieved with, the partner I'd relied on, had been planning my professional murder since the day I brought him into the company. Kira worked like a woman possessed, assembling an ironclad case that would expose Garrett's theft. But she knew documentation alone wouldn't be enough. We needed the investors to see the truth for themselves. "We're going to need more than evidence," she told me as we worked through the night in my apartment. "We need a story that cuts through Garrett's manipulation." She was right. Garrett was charismatic, persuasive, and had weeks to cement his narrative with the investors. My word against his might not be enough, especially given my obvious emotional investment in the outcome. But I had something Garrett couldn't fake: intimate knowledge of the technology itself. I knew every line of code, every design decision, every breakthrough moment that had led to Verde Bloom's creation. I could explain the reasoning behind innovations that Andy and Garrett could only copy. We prepared a presentation that would demonstrate my authorship beyond any doubt. Video logs from 2 years ago showing me testing early prototypes. Photos of my original sketches and diagrams. Email chains with suppliers and manufacturers from before Garrett joined the company. Most importantly, we prepared live demonstrations. I would code new features in real time, showing the investors exactly how someone with true understanding could extend and modify the system. Garrett and Andy could present a polished pitch, but they couldn't innovate on demand. "You're going to destroy them," Kira said with grim satisfaction. But first, I needed to get the investors to listen, and that meant going around Garrett entirely. I called Janie Brookfield at 6 a.m., knowing she'd be checking emails before her morning run. Her voice was cautious when she answered. "Ellie? How are you feeling?" "Like I've been betrayed by my own brother," I said without preamble. "Janie, I need to meet with you and the other investors. There are things about Nova Harvest you need to know." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Janie finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "That's a serious accusation, Ellie. Are you sure you're ready for this kind of stress so soon after? I'm sure, I interrupted. And I have proof. The meeting was set for that afternoon in Janie's downtown office. She'd invite the 3 key investors who'd backed Verde Bloom from the beginning. Herself, Thomas Brennan from Pacific Ventures, and Miranda Foster from Innovation Capital. I spent the morning rehearsing with Kira, preparing for every possible question or objection. We knew Garrett would try to discredit me as an unreliable narrator, someone whose illness had affected her judgment and memory. Stay calm, Kira coached me. Let the evidence speak. Don't get emotional, even when they challenge you. Easy to say. Harder to do when your entire life's work was on the line. As I walked into that glass-walled conference room that afternoon, I carried with me everything I needed to prove my case. Laptops full of evidence, documentation spanning 5 years, and the unshakable knowledge that I was fighting for more than just money. I was fighting for the truth. The investors' faces were skeptical when I walked into Janie's conference room. Thomas Brennan looked uncomfortable, checking his watch repeatedly. Miranda Foster maintained professional politeness, but her body language screamed reluctance. Garrett didn't know this meeting was happening. I needed the truth to hit them clean, without his spin. They'd been primed by Garrett to see me as unstable, a brilliant founder whose health crisis had affected her judgment. I could see it in their careful expressions, their gentle tones, their obvious surprise that Kira was there as legal counsel. Ellie, Janie began carefully, we're glad you're feeling better, but maybe this conversation should wait until what? I interrupted, setting my laptop on the conference table. Until Garrett has successfully stolen my company? I didn't give them time to respond. For the next hour, I methodically destroyed every lie Garrett had told them. The code analysis proving theft. The timeline showing the patent filings occurred during my coma. The forged emails and backdated documents. But the coup de grace was personal. I pulled up the original Verde Bloom prototype and began coding live modifications, explaining my design philosophy as I worked. I showed them why certain algorithms were structured the way they were, recounted the specific problems each innovation solved. Ask me about any component, I challenged them. Any design decision. Any technical choice. I can tell you not just how it works, but why I built it that way, what alternatives I considered, and which iteration finally solved the problem. Thomas leaned forward. Show us the nutrient delivery calibration system. I smiled. That was my favorite breakthrough, a problem I'd solved after 3 months of failed prototypes. As I walked them through the elegant solution, I saw recognition dawning in their eyes. This wasn't the presentation of someone who'd stolen technology. This was a creator explaining her life's work. Janie's face had hardened into anger. That son of a bitch. I didn't ambush Garrett. I called him and asked him to meet me at our office that evening. He probably expected another grateful conversation about how well he'd handled things during my recovery. What he found instead was me sitting at my desk, the lights dimmed, laptop open to the Nova Harvest source code. We need to talk, I said without looking up. Garrett's smile faded when he saw the code on my screen. His eyes darted to the Git logs displaying his theft, the patent applications open in browser tabs, the email chains between him and Andy spread across my monitor. Ellie, I can explain. Explain what? I finally looked at him, seeing a stranger wearing my brother's face. Explain how you've been planning to steal my company since the day I hired you. Explain how you used my coma as cover for fraud. Explain how you recorded our conversations to manufacture consent. He tried his old tactics, the reasonable tone, the protective older brother persona, the appeals to family loyalty. But I'd seen behind the mask now. You weren't going to make it, he said finally, dropping all pretense. The health scare proved that. Someone had to keep the company alive. Investors don't want a founder they can't rely on. So you decided to become that founder yourself. I saved this company. His voice rose, revealing the anger he'd hidden for months. While you were playing in your garage, I was building real value. You think your precious code matters more than my business development? You're brilliant, Ellie, but you're naive. I stood up, walked around the desk until I was facing him directly. You don't get to build your empire on my coma, Garrett. What empire? What are you going to do? I smiled for the first time in weeks. I already did it. The legal machinery moved faster than I'd expected. Kira had prepared everything in advance: cease and desist orders, patent violation claims, corporate fraud charges. By Thursday morning, Nova Harvest was frozen pending investigation. Garrett's resignation was announced that afternoon. The board didn't give him a choice. Janie had rallied the other investors, and they were furious about being manipulated. His shares were forfeit under the fraud provisions in his employment contract. Andy's termination was messier. He genuinely believed he was protecting the company, but his technical skills made him dangerous. We couldn't risk him starting another competing venture with stolen knowledge. When I called him into my office that Friday, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. I'm sorry, he said before I could speak. I believed him when he said you might not recover fully. I was scared of losing my job if the company failed. I studied his face, looking for deception and finding only regret. Andy was brilliant but naive, exactly the kind of person Garrett excelled at manipulating. You helped him steal 5 years of my work, I said quietly. I know. I'll resign today. I'll sign whatever non-compete agreements you want. I'll testify against Garrett if you pursue criminal charges. His contrition seemed genuine, but betrayal had made me skeptical of everyone's motives. Still, I understood fear-driven decisions better than most. I believe you're sorry, Andy. But sorry doesn't undo the damage. He nodded miserably and left my office for the last time. Verde Bloom belonged to me again, but the victory felt hollow. Trust, once broken, leaves scars that never fully heal. The $5 million funding round closed 6 weeks later, with me as sole CEO and majority shareholder. The investors had learned to appreciate my direct communication style after Garrett's elaborate deceptions. You're harder to read than your brother, Thomas admitted during our final negotiations. But we trust you more. Trust. Such a simple word for such a complex rebuilding process. Repairing Verde Bloom's technical infrastructure took months. Andy had done more damage than initially apparent, introducing subtle sabotage throughout the code base that required careful identification and correction. But line by line, algorithm by algorithm, I reclaimed my work. The first new installation went live in Detroit 3 months later. Watching those LED arrays illuminate rows of growing vegetables felt like vindication, not just of my technology, but of my refusal to let betrayal define me. News outlets picked up the story eventually. Founder recovers stolen startup, made for compelling headlines, especially with the family betrayal angle. Interview requests poured in, but I granted few. This wasn't a story I wanted to relive for entertainment. What mattered was the work. The next installations in Spokane and New Orleans. The waiting list of cities wanting Verde Bloom systems. The realization that food deserts could actually be conquered with the right technology and determination. Garrett disappeared from the tech scene entirely. LinkedIn showed he'd moved to Phoenix and taken a mid-level marketing position with a solar panel company. We never spoke again. Some bridges, once burned, should stay ashes. 2 years later, I walked through the Detroit installation at midnight, checking on the automated systems and enjoying the quiet. 37 modules humming softly, growing enough fresh produce to supply 3 local supermarkets and 4 community centers. The scars from Garrett's betrayal remain. I'm slower to trust, quicker to verify, more protective of my intellectual property. New employees face thorough background checks and ironclad contracts. I sleep with my phone nearby, always ready for the crisis call that might signal another theft. But paranoia has its benefits. Verde Bloom is stronger now, more secure, more resilient, more carefully guarded. We've expanded to 12 cities with plans for 20 more. The technology that Garrett tried to steal is feeding families across America. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if he'd never betrayed me. Would we have built something greater together? Would trust have carried us farther than competition ever could? Then I remember the look in his eyes that final evening, not remorse, but anger at being caught. Some people are willing to destroy others to get what they want. The question isn't whether they'll betray you. It's what you'll do when they do. I chose to rebuild. To heal. To prove that stolen dreams lose their power when the dreamer refuses to surrender. Verde Bloom grows on, stronger than ever, rooted in truth instead of deception. And every green leaf that unfurls under our lights is a victory over those who tried to bury me. Every leaf we grow now is a stitch sealing the wounds those 1,000 cuts left behind. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to stay down.